Welcome back to the Football Fitness Federation podcast. This is episode 186, and I'm delighted to welcome onto the podcast today, Bram Swinnen. Bram, how are you?
Fine, thank you. Thank you for welcoming me on your podcast, inviting me.
No problem at all. We just had a quick chat there about some of the topics we're going to cover, and I think the listeners are going to enjoy it. And I know you're a busy man as well, so I appreciate you freeing up some time to come on.
You always got time, eh?
Perfect. Well, Bram, I've just mentioned your name. I've not mentioned your role or anything that you do, and I'm sure there's some people that know already, but do you want to start us off with that? Do you want to give us a little bit of a breakdown on your career, your background, and then what you currently do as well?
I did a master's in physical education. After I did a master in physical therapy. At that moment, I was not really thinking about going into rehab, but I just wanted to know everything about training and especially the human body. From there, I went in basketball, first in Belgium, then into the national team, and from there, my international career kick-started, and I worked in 3 different teams, one in Moscow, one in Poland, one in Spain, like all top 8 teams, EuroLeague teams. And because I had the experience working in Moscow, I changed to football, to Anji, the team of Gus Hiddink, and many famous players at that moment. And that's about 10 years ago, and that's the way I rolled into football. That was a lot of traveling because every game was an away game. We trained in Moscow, but we played in Dagestan, so many flights. I wanted to settle down a little bit more after that. I was tired a little bit of the traveling, too much traveling. And I started a business together with Lieve Maarstag, the famous physiotherapist, moved to High Performance in Antwerp. And after 3 years, I got contacted by Genk. And since then, I combine, I'm a performance coach at Genk, and I combine it with my own practice and my own business.
Brilliant.
So that's mainly it.
And also an author.
Yes. I forgot about, thank you for reminding me. But that was after, like during you had a lot of flights with Anji, a lot of hotels. There I started to write my book, and then also half a year after that, I only wrote. So I took 6 months of time to really write it. And it's been an international success, and I'm also just really proud to be an author of a book. I wanted really to put my ideas into a book, and it's been a big success so far.
Brilliant. Well, I know we're going to try and cover a lot in this podcast today, but I'd also encourage people to go and get that, because I'm sure there's going to be more detail than what we can get through in an hour's podcast in the book. So people can go and check that out. I wanted to start this podcast sort of backwards. We normally do a quick fire round at the end of the podcast, but I've brought it forward just to find out a little bit more about yourself, and then we can dive into your philosophies and methodologies a little bit more. So one of the questions I normally ask is, who are some of the biggest influences on your career?
Otherwise, it was, I remember I discovered the books of Fleck and Kramer and Zaziorski. That was in my 3rd year in my Master's of Physical Education. Since then, I studied more those books than the topics in my curriculum. I started training some university athletes that were high-level athletes, but still at university, just for free because of the passion. And that was also triggered by those books. Straight out of college, I read an article about a first division basketball team, and it was a Croatian head coach, and he said, the team has no budget for a physical trainer. or for a performance coach and a physical therapist, I have to choose. So we have to take a physical therapist. So I applied right away. And the Tony Souverains was a team director and also the coach of the national team. I had a sit down with him, quite intensive, for an hour about topics like periodization, how I would implement everything on a practical. And after that hour, they gave me the job, and that's the way it started. Otherwise, I read a lot of different stuff. I was working for 5 years as a performance coach in Russia, and the Soviet methodology, it's a methodology that is it's based on research with the top athletes. So, for example, Prilipin, he studied training plans of only the top three, so bronze, silver, or gold medalists in the Olympics, the World Championships, and European Championships. And so some of the Soviet, like Prilipin, Bondarchuk, Verkhoshansky, so they definitely influenced my vision on training. And I would say any good researcher that really has research but applied to practice. There's so many. I'll also like, for example, from rugby, I like the books from Paul Gamble, many researchers on velocity-based training. A lot of them are Spanish that work with the football team of Sevilla. Rodriguez Rosell, for example. I like Andy Geukler as a researcher, but with really good practice. Anybody that has a good that eats of both worlds, so practice and research. So evidence-based, but more practical. And there's so many great colleagues out there. You also have like a very interesting story of Mladen Jovanovic, the way it started. There's so many guys, but I try to pick the brain of a lot of different people and apply it into my methods.
Brilliant. Next one I normally ask is, what would you say your biggest strength is as a practitioner?
I really develop myself. So I'm a performance coach and a physical therapist. So I'm definitely specialized in rehab, but the later stages of the rehab. So the moment the player is about to step on the pitch, and from there on, and from the performance part, I think I have a modern vision on performance training.
Brilliant. And it might tie into this a little bit, but I normally ask people how they do their learning, or we refer to it as like CPD, whether that's courses, which I know you run, but also you personally, how do you continue to learn? Is that through courses? Is that through conversations? What resources do you use? Like, how do you go about that? What's your approach?
I'm doing this now for a little bit more than 20 years on a professional level. And if I compare the last 10 years of my career with the first 10, then even the last 10, I learned more than the first 10. And I think also the higher level you get, the better colleagues you meet. So through conversation, I changed a little bit more from reading books to going more into articles and research. And of course, there are so many good courses out there. So once in a while, I try to pick a course as well.
Brilliant. And that just shows the strength as your sort of circle or close group of peers, doesn't it, that you build over a certain amount of times that you're referring to, because you can have conversations with some of the people that you've mentioned on the podcast already that have got big depths in knowledge. But that does come through experience, doesn't it? And through working through a number of years in high sport, in elite sport.
Yeah, I would definitely say passion and experience is a powerful mix. So There's so many passionate people in the field, also with a lot of experience or a lot of enthusiasm, and talking to them and what they're reading and how they're developing. It's always interesting.
Yeah, brilliant. You touched on it before. We wanted to get into some specifics now. Velocity-based training. It's something that I know you use a lot, and I know you've got a real good amount of experience in using it as well. So I want to, first of all, maybe we could give a little bit of a broad definition on what it is, just in case there's anyone listening that doesn't know. And then maybe some of the applied work that you do in terms of how it fits into your programming.
Yeah, velocity-based training, basically, it means that you don't prescribe repetitions, but instead you say, for example, when the speed drops with 10% within a set, then you stop, you quit the set. And that's the first set. It doesn't have to be the first repetition, because more technical movements, mostly like the second or the third rep, they're with the highest velocity. But based on the highest velocity, if you have a certain drop, then you stop the set, no prescription of repetitions. And you can apply like velocity-based 5%, you can apply 10%, 20%. And the good thing about velocity-based training is that you have a real good grasp on neuromuscular fatigue. And you know more exact when you can expect your peak or your, how you say it, like your supercompensation. So, for example, if you apply like a velocity loss of 10%, then after 5 hours, you have your supercompensation. There's no more neuromuscular fatigue. And when you work with a repetition-based approach, yeah, it's more guesswork. So also the good thing, if you work with a group with velocity-based training, there's automatically more individualization, because velocity loss 10%, if I prescribe it to a young athlete, he will probably do less repetitions than a trained athlete who has experience with strength training or performance training. So he will probably be able to do a little bit more. When you prescribe repetitions for the younger athletes, yeah, that load neuromuscularly will be heavier than for the experienced athlete. Also a good thing, the schedule, the roster of almost all teams in Europe are really congested. So it's difficult to do a lot of testing for one repetition maximum, but velocity-based training, also based on the speed, it's really easy to make an estimate of your maximum, and training becomes also testing.
Yeah, that was something I was going to actually mention, because you've already said you get more feedback out of using this rather than just sort of traditional strength training, don't you? Because it's a little bit more subjective.
Yeah, exactly. And sorry.
No, go on. Sorry.
It's also, it's a little bit difficult to explain without graphs, but you also have a very good, if you plot it into a graph, it's very easy to make an analysis of the player, what he needs, if he needs more like work at the velocity end of the curve or at the force end of the curve. It's more easy to adapt your periodization in function of what the player needs and the period of the year. So it has so many advantages, and data gathering, that you gather a massive amount of data is one of the big advantages.
Yeah, and then just picking out of that data as well, because obviously you're constantly monitoring in that way as well, aren't you? You're not having to set aside a session where you're going to do a monitoring session or a screening session, or maybe you'll do that as well, but this is constantly giving you feedback, isn't it?
Absolutely.
And there's a lot of fluctuations. You've just mentioned a busy period of a season. There's a lot of things that come into play with neuromuscular fatigue and fixture pile-ups and all the rest of it. So it's giving you direct feedback in an instant, isn't it?
Absolutely. Because doesn't matter with what percentage you work, but you always have an idea of the speed. You can estimate the 1 repetition maximum, and based on that, with every training, you can see if there's progress or not. Also, if there's some fatigue, if you see for 2 or 3 sessions in a row that there's no progress, but there's a little bit of decrease in the performance, then you know that you have to adapt some things, that there's neuromuscular fatigue, and it's really easy to, you're monitoring at the same time for neuromuscular fatigue and efficiency, so it's easy to adapt.
And then what about intent or intensity of a movement as well? Because players are getting that instant feedback, and like you've mentioned, it isn't a prescribed rep amount like we would with traditional sort of strength training. We're more looking at the speed and the velocity produced. Do you feel like there's a massive step up in the intent that players put into certain movements compared to more traditional like strength training?
Since I applied, I definitely see more progress. It's also because at the same time you have what they call augmented feedback. So on every rep, the player can see if it's a quality rep or it's less quality. That also in the brain triggers an area that's responsible for the action perception coupling. It's like a fancy word, but it means that the athlete, he knows right away this is a good rep, and he will change his movement more to the ideal, the good reps, and he will know which rep is not good, and so he will set his movement more to quality. So that's an important one. And augmented feedback immediately within a session, but also in the long term, has proven to help players progress more than without that feedback. I think also what's an important one, it's from research, it's really clear which percentages of velocity loss you choose based on the goal of the training. If I want to improve sprint performance, then I'm best off with 5%. So if I plan a speed strength session, more focused on explosivity, then I work more with 5 to 10%. If I want to improve like a counter movement jump, then I'm better off with 5 to 20% of velocity loss. If I want to trigger if I want most of hypertrophy for my fast twitch fibers, then I'm better off around 20%. Strength endurance, anywhere between 10 and 30%. So a lot. Also, that's probably the main advantage of velocity-based training, is that with the Holton curve, we are prescribing way too many repetitions. Because if you apply, for example, velocity loss of 10%, if you compare that with velocity loss 30%, you do half or 40% of the repetitions. And if you apply the Holton curve, then in a set, you have 60 to 70% of velocity loss based on the exercise. So that's enormous, that's huge. So with a lot less repetitions, you have a lot more gains, a lot more improvements. And what's also important, you have the post-activation potentiation effect when you apply complex training, or you do the performance session right before they step on the field. And that effect is a lot bigger, which is logical with velocity-based training. For example, velocity-based training, velocity loss 10%, than when you apply the Holton curve, because there's too much fatigue. The catabolic response of those training sessions is way too big. And for example, if you like the velocity loss 10% or velocity loss 30%, they have the same anabolic response. So insulin growth factor 1 is triggered at the same way. And there are studies before they started with velocity loss training. If you have 70% of your maximum, if you do 3 sets of 6 repetitions with 70%, or you do 3 sets of 12 repetitions, then the anabolic response in those studies was the same. but the catabolic response was a lot bigger with 3 times 12. With 3 times 6, you have super compensation starting after 5 or 6 hours. And with the other 3 times 12, that's only one exercise, 3 sets. So in strength training, you plan more. You're still in fatigue after 48 hours. And in strength training, it's never isolated. You always have to consider it with the load, the mechanical load on the pitch. So it's never ideal to do a strength training and still have no full recuperation within 48 hours.
Yeah, and touching on those rep or the sort of traditional way we've approached rep schemes in football. I don't know whether it's just that we've pulled it more from the bodybuilding world, is it? Doing these high rep sets without maybe the understanding of what you've just touched on, and actually understanding what we're trying to train for. Because you see it traditionally a lot of the time, don't you, where players are doing 10, 12, 20 repetitions on some exercise and not really getting the desired effect of what they're training for. And that comes down to that understanding, doesn't it?
And the biggest disadvantage of repetition-based training is that you see, for example, a lot of repetitions, they cause a lot of neuromuscular fatigue. Really slow movement speed causes a lot of neuromuscular fatigue. And also slow movement speed, it has nothing to do with the explosive contractions and the short contact times that we see in football. It's an explosive sport. We don't have to lift extremely heavy to gain strength. Even if you see like Bondarchuk, who's like really one of the experts in powerlifting, mostly he lifts between 70 and 80% of maximum to increase his athletes 1 repetition maximum. So we don't need, sometimes you can do a set of 90%, but that doesn't have to be often. And especially when you play 2 times a week and you have a player that plays most of the games, then you don't want to go there.
Yeah. And that's when that direct feedback or instant feedback becomes even more applicable, isn't it? Because you can see how fatigued that player is.
And also, I think the most important thing, if you have like maximum sprinting speed, or you have even like a football kick, the velocity, the movement velocity is so high. It's really at the speed end of the force velocity curve. And it has nothing to do with the pure force part of the curve. So if you're doing really lifts to failure or close to failure, those movement speeds are really low. You're at 0.3 meters a second. Well, in football, you're a lot higher. So they have no influence. One has no influence on the other, especially in top athletes.
Yeah, 100%. And for you in programming, Bram, as well, you've touched on the force velocity curve and sort of how that can influence like what you're doing and what you're programming. But when you've got a group in as well, does that make it a lot easier for you to program for different individuals within the team setting as well?
It is easier because you already have that individualization. And it's also it's easy to apply. It's easy, for example, that still players, they have more or less the same training, but they have a different velocity loss prescribed. So some can have, for example, compare 2 athletes. One, he made progress on the whole force velocity curve. So from the force end to the velocity end. And we're going more towards the end of the season. In Belgium, we have the playoffs. With that player, I know he has a good base, a good string base. I can work more at the velocity end of the curve, so I can focus more on the 5 to 10% velocity loss. If I have a player and he made good gains at the speed end of the curve, but not really progress at the force end, with him I will mix in a little bit more Also, like maybe velocity loss 20%, depending on the planning and periodization, of course. I'm not going to do 2 days before the game. I'm not going to plan in 20% velocity loss.
No.
There, I will keep it more with 5 or 10%. But if it's 4 days before the game, with that player, I will go a little bit more to 20% velocity loss. And the other player, I will keep him at 5 or maximum 10. But
and that could be on the same exercises.
That could be on the same exercises. Of course, the exercises can also differ, but it can be the same exercise, but the focus of the training is different. And the good thing, you don't have to explain it to each player.
Yeah.
Like they just check in. So we work with the smart coach on Kaiser. So they check in, they know what weight they have to select. They perform the exercise, and as long as the smart coach, he gives the augmented feedback of good or high, they continue. Low, they stop. That's the only thing they have to know. You don't have to explain them about, okay, you're going to do that many reps there, that many reps there. You just check in and you continue high speed, high quality at each repetition. The moment it says low, you stop.
Brilliant.
I do have to say, with explosive work, for example, a jump squat, alternating step-up jumps, with those exercises, I prescribe a maximum number of repetitions, just in case. Because less experienced athletes, because of movement adaptation, because the eccentric phase becomes slower, so because of that compensation, they can stay sometimes a long time in that they maintain a good average speed. So peak power is better for explosive exercise, for monitoring, but there I prescribe a maximum number of repetitions. So you do, for example, you do 7 or 8 max, but if the machine, if it says low at 4 or 5, you stop.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Great insight. Yeah, that was one thing that I wanted to ask about as well, was you touched on there maybe the differences between certain exercises. In terms of exercise selection and maybe how that differs from one exercise to another, how does that influence your programming? Is there standards or set exercises that you go to?
I apply what's called from Bernstein in motor learning, what also touched by Franz Bosch, is like repetition without repetition. So I want to have a lot of variation, not in one session, but especially throughout the sessions. So a lot of different movement patterns. For example, you have a single leg squat, you have a single leg rotational squat, you have a single Bulgarian deadlift, a lot of different exercises. So without rotation, more vertical force or like more horizontal force. So I want to vary a lot there to have a more robust movement pattern. But I want to mix in horizontal force production. So as well from an acceleration perspective as from an agility perspective, because horizontal force production is also really important for my agility performance in the last and the second last step. So I mix that with vertical force production or vertical stiffness. So, but I variate with I variate a lot between sessions. So I also have, for example, my different goals. So I have, like, for example, strength endurance, which is a lot of different movement patterns, a lot of rotation. I also try to train a lot there, the myofascial systems. There are probably a little more repetitions. Then I have like a more pure strength session. There I still do, for example, squats, so double leg training. And then I have like speed strength and a strength speed session. Strength speed is more based on complex training. So a strength exercise combined with an explosive exercise, or a strength exercise combined with a sport-specific exercise, or even like plyometric exercise combined with a sport-specific exercise, or ballistic. So anything works there. And the speed strength session, that's really the icing on the cake. There, I stay away from the heavy lifting. I think I go maximum till 70% of one repetition maximum. But I use a lot of ballistic exercise. For example, the alternating step-up jump. So a step up, but I ask the player like to jump out. So like with the rack of Kaiser, you can still do that in a safe way. There are many ways you can still do it in a safe way. Because of course, if you work ballistic, it has to be safe. So I combine their ballistics with plyometrics, or ballistics with sport specific. And I definitely want to integrate like a cognitive part in that training, like the dual tasks.
Yeah, and that's something I want to dive into in a little bit. But just on what you just mentioned, when you're saying sport specific, how does that look? So if you're pairing like a plyo exercise with sport specific, like what does that actually look like?
They can, for example, they can be, for example, like hurdle jumps, or it can be plyometric exercises. That's a little bit more into horizontal force production. So for example, you jump over a hurdle, you change direction on the left, and you line up for the next hurdle, which is more on your right side. So then you have like the horizontal force production and change of direction. And I combine that, for example, with a drill, with the lights, with the reaction lights, but with a cognitive element. That there's always some decision making. And then I prefer also to integrate, or to have a build-up, start only with the footwork. For example, I line out 8 lights. When it lights up red, they have to touch right, blue, left. And I'm going to build that up. So even I'm going to introduce more colors. And with every color, I ask a different action. And also with playing the ball. So a little bit difficult to explain, but also on my social media, you have a lot of examples of those exercises.
That is one thing I'd say for everyone to go and check out, because you put out loads of great content, and it makes it, a lot of the stuff you're talking about, I know it can be hard to explain so much, but if you watch it, it makes a lot more sense, doesn't it? So no, that's great, Bram. We'll move on to the dual task training in a second, because I want to ask you about that. Just on the end of that though, I did put out on our socials for people to send some questions in. And one thing that was sent in around velocity-based training was velocity-based training for youth players. So what, if someone's asking about, like, would you use it with youth players, and then how you would use it with youth players, like, what would you say?
I would definitely use it with youth players. I know a lot of the equipment is a little bit more expensive. So we use the Kaiser with the Smart Coach. That's more expensive equipment. If you don't have that equipment, you can still use the VMAX Pro. It's also what we use, for example, when we do single leg squats. So you can put it like in the GPS vest if you do a single leg squat without weight, or it's like a magnet that you stick on the bar. That's the only thing that requires you stick it on the bar, and you can choose. You can select. Okay, you want feedback on velocity loss during the set, and with every repetition, it says 9%, 11%, and then they know when to stop. And that only costs like 279 euros. The software is really easy to use and really good. So anybody can use that. So even if you, even with, you don't need a lot of equipment and fancy stuff to apply it. And there are scientific studies that even have shown that it's really reliable.
And what about ages, Bram, in terms of like, what sort of age would you look to be starting something like this?
I start working with players here at the age of 10. But of course, in the beginning, it's more about movement experience, movement patterns. And I introduced straight away the cognitive part, because the younger, the better. The more plastic the nervous system, the easier you make connections between neurons. And when they have more experience, I enter more into the quality work. I would say with the athletes that I work, that starting from 13, I apply it. So depending a little bit on how mature a player is, but for me, it's not the age that depends doesn't depend on the age. It's on the progress and the way the athlete picks up the training. It's at a young age that it's fun and the movement experience is very important. And yeah, the intensity, those qualities, those parameters, they become, once you have that base, that becomes more important. So then I would start to integrate it with the players I work with.
Yeah, anyone that's worked with academy players will know there's a big, simply the chronological age isn't the only factor, is it, on prescribing training to a player? There's a lot of other factors that go into it, but I just thought I'd get your opinion on that as well. Bram, let's dive into this dual task training. You mentioned it before. What is it? And how does that actually look in your programming?
I'm going to give you a quick example that people can grasp a little bit more what I want to mean. If you ask him to do a sprint, just a test during training, so the only thing you ask him, he has to do like a sprint. If you compare that with him doing a sprint during a game, like his running mechanics are different. Only because of the cognitive load that you have during the game. During the game, you're looking at all the positions of the other players, with the player with the ball, the tactical pattern. So there's a lot of cognitive load. And because of the load in a game, the stride length from sprinting is bigger than you just do it at a speed test. And that's because it's what the neural code, gate code, they call it, because sprinting is an automatic movement that comes from the brain at the cerebellum and at the basal ganglia. Yeah, I don't want to make it too technical, but it's just a small part that your motor cortex is involved in those movement patterns. But when you have a lot of cognitive load, also the automated movement patterns, they become more conscious. And they go to different parts of your brain. What you also see is that the endpoint variability of movement is bigger when there's a higher cognitive load. And more novice athletes, they have big problems the moment that they come in a stressful situation, or they come in a situation where they have to take quick decisions and complicated quick decisions. Their movement deteriorates a lot. And expert athletes, they don't have that. Also because the movement is engraved deeper into like deeper brain areas, what they call like the reptile brain, for example. And they're also less immune to stress and less immune to fatigue. So that's all scientifically proven. And my perspective as a performance coach is that if you want to build good movement, if you want to develop good movement, then you also need to provide cognitive load or dual tasks. I don't say that you only can give an exercise with a dual task, but like regular dual task into performance training is an important trigger for better movement patterns and even for higher quality of higher quality of movement, and better motor learning. So another part, what's important, what we, for example, do with the goalkeepers is the day after the game, we do a lot of dual task things. Because in football, you have peripheral fatigue and central neuromuscular fatigue. And almost all recuperation sessions, or the full recuperation session, is always based more on the lateral fatigue, like peripheral fatigue. But in football, based also on the athlete, based on the position, but research, according to research, is like most part of the fatigue is localized central neuromuscularly. And with a cognitive load, you improve like the activation of the motor cortex, which is the opposite of fatigue, because there you see an inhibition of the motor cortex. So I'm also convinced, and we use it in that way in Genk, is that we use cognitive training also to help central neuromuscular recovery. So especially with goalkeepers after the game, because goalkeepers, throughout the whole game, they have to maintain a very high focus. And even sometimes at top teams, goalkeepers, they don't have a lot of work, but they have to catch 2-3 important balls that they have to catch. But they have to maintain the focus throughout the whole game. So I would say, dual task, movement quality, very important. It helps with motor learning, and you have a higher output of the motor cortex. So also quality in your performance session, it can only help.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And again, just to go back into academy players and academy ages again, because you mentioned before about utilizing this at those early ages. So would it be a case of learning a movement and having this as a continuum, where once they start to improve that movement, then you could add dual task training in? Or would it be that you put it in quite early, because then that maybe speeds up the progression of the development?
You can separate it in a way that, for example, you have an easy movement. So, for example, just play back the ball, and you start with a cognitive load, and always improve, always make it more difficult. But you can also first, like, for example, start with a movement, and let's say just like an explosive strength movement. For example, a resisted crossover step for lateral agility. And when the player, like, it goes both ways. You make a movement to the left, and that's the resisted part. You go back, and that's the overspeed part. When you go to the left, for example, you ask the player to count +5 and go back and count -2. So it's 5, 3, it's 8, 6. And you ask him, okay, you keep counting until you reach that number. So you have a control about the repetitions, but he has to, and for some players, that's already too difficult. So, but even that is a cognitive load. And you would be surprised how quick they pick it up. So I think the key with dual task is to give a cognitive load that doesn't really deteriorate the quality of movement. If there's too much deterioration of the quality of movement, then the cognitive load it's too difficult.
Yeah, there's some players that I've worked with, Bram, that might struggle with the counting bit by itself without the actual exercise. But no, I know exactly what you mean, and that's a great example. Is there something else that you can give in terms of an example of utilizing this? Because I think it's a really interesting area, and maybe just delving into some other parts of your programming and how you use it as well.
For example, the goalkeepers in the performance session, so in the strength session, in between two exercises, a lot of times we do something cognitive with eye-hand coordination. So that we want them really to keep high focus throughout the whole session. So, for example, the strength exercise can also be without a cognitive load, just the strength task related, and then they have like a cognitive drill, and then again like a performance exercise. So anything is possible. I think there variation is key, because what you want to trigger is a lot of plasticity of the nervous system, a lot of connections between neurons. And what's even very interesting is that even the latest years, the last 3-4 years, you have a lot of research that show that too task-oriented training and rehab with too much internal feedback is one of the big reasons of the high relapse with, for example, hamstring injuries, ACL injuries, with you have a lot of injuries that have a really high relapse rate. And more and more studies are pointing towards too much task-related training instead of dual task training, and too much internal feedback. Because it's logical. On a pitch, a player, he's not only focused, or he's not focused at all on his movement. He's focused on other things. So in rehab, if you're going to focus only on the movement, yeah, it's two different things. Because for good athletes, like expert athletes, their movement is completely automated. And what you do in rehab is you pull them back into development more from the learning phase. You have the associative phase, and then you have the automatization phase. You pull them back in that continuum. So you disrupt highly efficient movement with the rehab. So, and it's been shown that in rehab, dual tasks are very important to make it successfully on the pitch again.
No, that is really interesting. Really interesting how it fits into the rehab process. We did a podcast with Richard Evans, who's with the Belgium national team at the moment, and he was talking about his time at Wigan Athletic, and a player went through a rehab process, and they got him back out onto the training pitch, and he just didn't look like he was ready to be out there, essentially. And Richard stepped up and said, "We need to take him back." And it's at that stage, isn't it, that's crucial, because if you get a player out back on the pitch or the training pitch, is that job done, or is it still a case of, are they actually ready? And because then there's that chance of that relapse, isn't there?
It's good that you mentioned that, because a lot of players, when they come from rehab, they're really well trained, and also in today's game, in today's clubs, you have a really good interaction with the rehab coach, the physical therapist, and the fitness coach. So a lot of times there was more than enough focus on conditioning during the rehab. So it's not the conditioning that's the problem. Mm-hmm. But a lot of times it's the quick decision making. If you don't touch this for several weeks, your brain is a lot more plastic than your body, so it changes quicker. Like neurons that you don't, connections between neurons that you don't use, you lose. So they step on the pitch, their decision making, their anticipation is not that good as before. Their coordination is less, their movement efficiency is less. They get tired more quickly, and they're more prone to re-injury. So it's a really essential part of rehab.
And again, Bram, would that be a sort of continuum that you would start on the basis of the rehab, and then the dual task stuff will come towards the end, or would it be something that you'd be trying to add in earlier on in the process?
I'm rehabbing now somebody, an ACL injury, 6 months after surgery, and I'm integrating brain training, because you see there's, after surgery, after injury, you have a big inhibition from the motor cortex, so you cannot fully activate the muscle. So if you only use strength training, with a combination of brain training with strength training, it's more easy to regain strength during the first weeks of rehab. And that's scientifically proven. Because if you see with all ACL, after ACL reconstruction, like strength level is a lot less, but also what you see is activation. There's a lot more inhibition from the motor cortex. So only correcting on the, you also need to correct that inhibition and turn it into activation again.
So what would that look like for an actual drill for that player? Because if they're 6 months post-surgery, I think I've seen the player you're talking about actually on your socials, but I see some of the strength stuff that you're doing with them, but how would that then look in terms of the dual task?
I would, for example, it doesn't have to be lights. It can also be just an iPad. And I can show colors, numbers, and with each color or number, it's combined with a different exercise. For example, number 1 can be like a small step up. Right, number 2 is the same movement on the left. Green color can, for example, be like a single leg squat, but or a single leg Romanian deadlift. Anything that the player can do at that moment. So things that he can do or are just within reach. And then he has to think, he has to focus, he has to think. I also put everything like so that he has like to scan visually. So that's already a cognitive trigger. So that perception that he has to really scan, where are the lights? He has to look, scan the environment. And based on the signal, he has to make a movement. And it's a small cognitive load, but I find it very, very effective.
No, it is really, really interesting how that's incorporated. And yeah, it's just fascinating how it's actually working in practice. And it'll be interesting to see how many people are actually utilizing that. And also, like you say, when there's more and more research coming out about this on how many this sort of effect it has on relapses or re-injury, that's going to be really interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. But it's, you always have to look at the big picture, and you can not only affect one end of the curve when there are more elements involved. So the more you combine, the more effective, the more the easier it is to make progress.
Bram, the time has absolutely flown on this podcast. I feel like we've only been chatting about 5 minutes and we're just short of an hour already. So I said at the start that the sort of depth that we could probably go into in this podcast is probably just skimming the surface. And I know that's probably the case. So for people that want more information, maybe the book, maybe the courses that you run, or simply just to sort of follow your work and see what you're up to and maybe see some of this stuff in practice, where would you direct them? Where's the best places to keep up to date?
I think I show some of the exercises on my social media, so LinkedIn or Instagram. And yeah, we now in 3 weeks, we have an international 2-day football performance course. And there we have, it's English spoken. It's fully in English. It's 14 hours. And there will be from all over Europe, from 11 countries, somebody from first division. So, and also one Brazilian trainer. So it's really international, and there I would go really in depth, and especially about planning, periodization, my methodology. Yeah, you can also find it in my book.
Brilliant. And there's more courses to come as well after that?
Everything till now is fully booked. The last course I was sold out in less than 10 minutes, 25 spots. But it's been a huge success. We're going to evaluate after the international course, and then we will see. But it has been a big success, so we probably continue with more courses. So I would say, stay tuned.
Yeah, perfect. Well, Bram, keep up the amazing work. I've been following what you've got going on, and it's great to chat with you today. I feel like there's been some great discussions there. So thank you very much for your time.
Likewise, it was a big pleasure.
Thank you, mate.
Okay, thank you. See you.